experts are constantly amazed by how good ordinary people are at making decisions if they're put in a good situation. And look, the average person on the street, of course, says totally stupid things when they're vox popped, when they're sort of ambushed by the media or they're just asked for a knee-jerk reaction. But you put people in these citizens' assemblies, you train them, you get them in a mindset where they're listening and they're thinking and they're reflecting and shifting their views. And people do absolutely astounding work. So the problem with democracy is not people. It's the situations in which we've been asking them to do their democratic work.
I'm Ranjor, and this is Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. In each episode, I talk to someone who's trying to change our lives for the better in some meaningful way, whether through a new product, new venture, or a new way of looking at the world. And I try to understand how they came to it, what makes them tick, and what we can learn from them. Max Rashbrooke's TED Talk on upgrading democracy has touched a nerve and has been viewed over 1 million times in a matter of months. He's a Wellington-based writer and public intellectual with twin interests in economic inequality and democratic renewal. His latest book is Too Much Money, about wealth disparities in New Zealand, and his previous books include Government for the Public Good, The Surprising Science of Large-Scale Collective Action. Max is a senior associate of the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies. His work appears in outlets such as The Guardian and Prospect Magazine. In this conversation, we talk about how moving from a wealthy school to a failing school in a low-income neighborhood opened his eyes to his own privilege and the extent of poverty in the world. How he became fascinated with the problem of entrenched and compounded inequality and lack of mobility as a financial journalist in London during the financial crisis. The dangers of increasing inequality and immobility, and how it leads to a mistrust in institutions, an attraction to populist authoritarianism, and a crisis for democracy. How he proposes to upgrade democracy for the digital age by increasing participation and incorporating tools like citizen assemblies, online consensus building, and participatory budgeting. And why having faith in our fellow citizens and in the power of government to do good is essential to healing democracy in our lifetime. I really enjoyed talking to Max and hope that you'll enjoy his excellent introduction to the growing movement of more participatory democracy. Max is one of dozens of great conversations with thinkers, activists, and makers who are trying to remake our lives in some meaningful way. If you don't want to miss them, please make sure you subscribe in your favorite podcast player. And now, let's jump right in with Max Rashbrooke. All right, I'm sitting here with Max Rashbrooke. Max, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So the mandatory question these days is about how you experienced COVID. And so I'd love to hear where in the world you experienced it primarily, how did it affect you personally and then professionally? What was your experience?
Right, yeah. So I'm based in Wellington, New Zealand, and have been here throughout the pandemic. I guess a big difference between sort of the personal and political. I guess personally, I haven't been greatly affected. I've always worked from home. I've continued to work from home throughout the pandemic. And of course, in New Zealand, as people may know, we've been incredibly fortunate in the sense that we've gone pretty hard and tough on the lockdowns. We've had very few deaths. We're still only in the 30s, although we're now struggling with Delta and other variants, just like everyone else. Still very concerned about the effects that it's had on our society and particularly on the globe. But me personally, I'm lucky just being, to be honest, quite insulated from some of its effects. I've been very fortunate in that sense.
Yeah, it's amazing to talk to different people everywhere in the world. People experience it differently. I speak to some people from Australia, and they didn't suffer the first wave as most of the world did, but then they had a wave later on. But New Zealand is a model to the world, but it's also an island, so it's much easier to contain.
We had some luck on our side, definitely, and also because people got to New Zealand, started arriving with COVID later than in a lot of other countries. We'd had time to see what other countries were doing, weigh up the options. And yeah, we definitely had some advantages on our side, I think.
Did it affect you professionally at all? Did you do more writing about COVID? Because it's interesting, the political effects it has around the world and the effects on the inequality that I know you care about. So how did it affect you professionally?
Yeah, I've focused a fair bit on the intersection between inequality and COVID. And because in New Zealand, even with the relatively mild effects, it's still split along socioeconomic, along what you might call class lines. It's been a very different experience of COVID for people like me, frankly, knowledge workers who can keep working from home, who've got good internet connections, who are relatively comfortable, versus people who were frontline workers who had to keep going out to work during the height of the pandemic, putting themselves at risk, poor internet connections at home, so limited ability to keep, their children connected to education digitally, often living in overcrowded housing. And particularly in New Zealand, the economic response to COVID has sort of really been a lot of low interest rates, money sloshing around, and that's really boosted house prices, growing the divide between people who own housing and people who don't.
Yeah, there were moments where I felt this in the news in Israel in the first wave or the second wave. It was a small food cart vendor on the news crying that he can't open, he can't do anything. And he's like, well, how can I feed my family? And the immediate response, which I immediately judge, is I'm just get on these apps, do delivery. But that's our pretty privileged mindset because we are still spoiled. Tech worker, I order food every day on these apps, and it's I'd love to have more food, but does he even know how to operate that technology? Does he have a good enough smartphone? So I think it's a lot of divides, right? The financial divide, the digital divide. So I'd love to start these conversations with a question about the person behind these ideas and activities. And so my first question is usually, what's something you learned in childhood or early in life anyway that still drives you today, that's still affecting how you move in the world today?
Interesting question. I think for me, it would probably be the high school that I attended. I grew up in a very wealthy part of New Zealand, very wealthy part of Wellington. And so went to what we in New Zealand would call a primary school that was, also relatively wealthy. But when it came to send me to high school, my parents felt that it would be good for me to go to a high school that was quite socially mixed and ethnically mixed. So I went to, trying to translate it into global terms, let's just say a relatively poor and struggling high school, frankly. And that just really was a very powerful experience. I did absolutely fine educationally, but more importantly, I was just exposed to these lives of children who were growing up in completely different homes to mine, homes with quite significant poverty, sometimes parents out of work, a lot of broken households. It just opened my eyes and made me realize what a fortunate life I was living and how much poverty there was even in a developed country like New Zealand. And I think that's been a really formative experience.
So what made your parents make that pretty unusual decision? Was it ideology? Was it they feel like you were going in a too privileged direction and wanted to course correct? What was the thinking? I think that's very brave.
Yeah, I guess it was probably, as with most things in life, a sort of mixture of things. And there was a certain amount of accident thrown into the mix. I mean, I'm not sure it was a sort of brilliantly conceived plan. There's not a huge number of high schools sort of available in our area. But I think there was also, my parents have always believed in, what in New Zealand we put quite a lot of stress on fairness, that idea that society should be fair, whatever that means. And they always brought us up to recognize that we'd been lucky in life. And I think they did worry about us, me and my sisters leading slightly privileged lives or whatever. And they thought it'd be a good experience for me to be in a small, quite diverse school. And they were confident, that I'd get through it fine, which of course I did.
Yeah. So I'll ask maybe one more question about your experiences there, but I want to connect this because I have a lot of friends in the States who are now in the process of looking for schools for the kids because the kids are just about to enter school. And there's a lot of private school options. And some of them, you hear about them and you understand what they give you, and they can make kids into geniuses. They can, there's Montessori schools and there's all of these schools that have just phenomenal success rates versus the public schools that are not very good. And yet, obviously, it's about money. It's about the ability to send kids to these schools. And it's a real dilemma for people, especially people who are more liberal and believe in equality, but they know that this school is going to open enormous doors and going to build enormous capabilities, and they can afford the school.
Yeah, I mean, it is a tricky one that's facing every parent, that choice. My own view is that certainly in New Zealand, the public school system is absolutely worth trusting. And actually, certainly the evidence in New Zealand is that public schools teach pretty much as well as private schools. Private schools get better marks, but that's just because they have richer students, to be really crude about it. And I think there's quite a lot of international evidence to the same effect. And often, unfortunately, what you're buying in a private school is social positioning, is connection, getting your kids alongside, quote unquote, the right other kids. And while I can understand the drive to do that from an individual parent point of view, I think that has very negative social effects. I mean, that creates a more stratified and more segregated society. And my own experience of going to, like I said, a very poor public school was that actually, it was fine academically because I was growing up in a household where you couldn't move for books, and my parents were highly educated and very stable. And actually the biggest driver of children's educational success is their home. The evidence on that is really strong. So my own personal view is send your kids to the public school. They'll be fine and society will be better off.
So is there from your school period a specific moment that kind of stuck in your memory about, wow, this is the people living very differently from me? And were you able to connect with people who were very different for you? Were you able to make connections across these divides?
Yeah, to some extent. I think one of the moments that sticks with me was maybe less about people's specific material circumstances and more about the poverty of ambition that leads to, or what's expressed. I remember this kid, we were in second to last year of high school and the last year of compulsory schooling. And I remember this kid saying, it's great, I'm going to leave school next year, I'm going to go on the unemployment benefit, and it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it. Now, if that was the sort of clip that was just played on TV or talk about radio or whatever, and you didn't know this person, a lot of people would be furious. Oh, look at these terrible attitudes. There's people who are milking the system. But I knew that this kid saying it didn't believe it. They weren't optimistic about it. They didn't think that was a great future. But they also felt that was their future. And no one likes to admit that they hate the thought of what's coming down the track at them. And so it was just, it was a performance. They didn't believe it. I mean, they were incredibly depressed about their future, but they had to say that to save face. And that was just one thing I learned from being there with those kids and knowing them that I would never have learned if I'd just seen those other kids from afar.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so you grew up and you studied, I think, English literature and then became a reporter, a financial reporter in London. So what was that journey like? Were you always fascinated by the economy, by numbers? What was that journey like in the early years?
Again, there was some large elements of luck. And I was both a political and a financial journalist at different points in time in the UK. I guess I'm lucky in that I've always had a sort of balance of, these terms are a bit hackneyed now probably, but right brain and left brain. I did a whole bunch of maths right through to what you'd call college level in the States, as well as the English literature. We have quite a flexible education system in New Zealand. So I'd always been comfortable around the maths. And I mean, to be honest, I fell into the financial reporting. There was just, I needed a new job at a particular point in time in London, and that was the job that was available. But I really took to it, and I guess I took to it because, I love seeing how things work. Not in a mechanical sense. I'm hopeless mechanically. If I take something to bits, I can't put it together again. But in a human, in a personal sense, in a system sense, I love knowing how things work, and economics is about understanding those systems of decision-making. So I really took to it. And apart from anything else, this was London in the late 2000s. The global financial crisis, I pretty much had a front row seat for that whole shebang.
And that's where you started writing about inequality and being interested in inequality. And for an audience like ours, which has a fair bit of people from the startup world and, entrepreneurship and tech, when you talk too much about inequality, I think it's almost like there's an assumption that you are coming from like a communist utopia kind of place, and that the very fact that someone is making a little bit more than another person is bad. Is that what you mean when you're concerned about inequality? Is that where you're coming from? Or is there more nuance to it?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I think that there's a lot more nuance. I mean, I do get that criticism, and I think it stems from a problem around the word inequality itself often. Because if you say you're concerned about inequality, there is a natural reaction for people to think, oh, well, you must want total equality then. Right. You must want everyone to have exactly the same amount. And of course, I don't. There are reasons for economic inequality that people will always accept if people genuinely work harder than others or decide to take on more responsibility or whatever. But also I fundamentally think that, as Maya Angelou put it, we are more alike than we are unalike. Actually, the differences between us as humans, when you consider our common capacity to love and to dream and to pursue goals, are quite small. And the real reason I care about economic inequality is not because of the inequality itself. It's because of the opportunities that are created or closed off by possessing greater wealth or lacking it. And particularly in America, there's the dialogue around opportunity, and that's the thing that matters. But you can't separate opportunity from economic inequalities. For me, one of the absolute sort of key graphs that tells a story is this thing called the Great Gatsby graph. And it says, as your society becomes more unequal, what happens to equality of opportunity? And you see that in a country like America, which has these very big disparities between rich and poor, you can predict half of your income from what your parents earn. So in a sense, for all the talk about hard work and individual choice in a place like America, half of your income is predetermined. You can tell what it's going to be just based on who your parents were, because you've actually had those advantages passed down. Whereas in, the classic society that's held up at the other end of things, Denmark, only 15% of your income can be predicted from what your parents earned. To come back to that question, none of this is about imposing a sort of rigid communism on people. It's just saying, well, actually, if there's massive disparities between rich and poor, you can't say that people have an equal start in life.
So would it be fair to say, maybe a better term for this would be not inequality, but compounded inequality, the fact that inequality gets worse and dooms certain people to remain forever unequal, that it's no longer about individual efforts, it's about a really different starting point. It's a very rigid class structure that's beginning to form.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're right, it's compounding inequality and it's intergenerational inequality. Yeah, I mean, what is a class system other than some people having more wealth than others, using it to buy a whole lot of advantages that aren't available to other people and then passing them on to their children? And that's literally the definition of a class society, and then social mobility gets constrained between those groups because the people with wealth become what I believe sometimes termed opportunity hoarders. They hold those opportunities very closely to themselves and their children. And the vision of a more equal society, which is more equal, not perfectly equal, is just one in which, there's still some little differences between rich and poor, but that wealth that people has doesn't buy them a profoundly different life. It doesn't buy them profoundly different advantages. It doesn't buy a profoundly better set of opportunities for their children. Some people will still have Ferraris and some people will drive whatever cheap car is internationally, Ford Fiesta or whatever, but everyone's got enough for a good education, good healthcare, decent start in life, decent job, good prospects, the ability to retire and security, all those basic things.
You write that there's no progress on inequality. There's no serious movement to correct it. Can you speak more to that? Why isn't there any change? Why is it only getting worse?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit sort of what scale you take, because in the last 30 to 40 years, globally, some kinds of inequality have reduced as some poorer countries have caught up to the richer countries, and notably China, obviously, and to some extent India. So you could say that some things have got better on that global level, but within developed countries, there's been this huge increase in inequality in the last 40 years, and that's really well known. And I mean, it's funny, the dialogue around inequality has completely changed. So, those big international bodies, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, they used to be cheerleaders for inequality and now are very concerned about it, and they're coming out and recommending wealth taxes and a whole suite of things you would have thought were very radical. Yet very little has actually changed on the ground, I would say, in most developed countries. And that is for a whole tranche of reasons. Partly, some of the companies that drive this inequality are very powerful, partly because some political systems, I think, are quite distorted by money and lobbying and influence. And partly also because I think in a lot of countries, and this is certainly true in New Zealand, there's a lack of faith in the ability of politics and collective action to change anything. A lot of people have been brought up in a world where they have the sense that there's no alternative to inequality. And that ideology is still a very powerful constraining force.
And so when you say there's no trust, is there something special today about how we don't trust politicians? Because in the past, I look at many Western countries, they did pretty ambitious things like creating social security, like creating welfare programs that actually work. What's happening to us today?
It's a different story everywhere, of course. Globally, there's been a huge decline in trust in politics and politicians, most pronounced in America, where the graph of, do you trust politicians basically to do the right thing is just like, someone falling down a mountain. It's incredibly steep. That's been less pronounced here. I mean, New Zealand's a small society. We still have relatively quite high trust in our politicians. So I think there's been a widespread sense that the political settlement of the last 40 years is sort of government stepping away from things, letting the market do its thing. There's sort of the trickle-down theory that if you allow wealthy people to become very wealthy, that'll trickle down to everyone else. A lot of that, people have become very disillusioned with that, unsurprisingly, because that system didn't deliver on its promises. It delivered greater instability, it delivered widening inequality, and of course, it didn't create, but has exacerbated the climate crisis that we're all grappling with. So I think that's engendered a huge distrust in politics and politicians. But also, because that ideology has been very powerful, to give you just sort of one anecdote from New Zealand, if you run sort of focus groups, so, little groups with, say, 10 people in them, New Zealanders are very egalitarian people, and most people will start in these focus groups by saying, oh, things should be fairer, the disparities between rich and poor are too great. And it only takes one person in this focus group who's a bit of a market realist to say, oh, look, yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be nice for things that are more equal? But look, people get paid what they're worth. The market determines that, and you can't do anything about it. And everyone else in the group just shuts up. They just crumble. It's not like they believe that things should be this way, but they just have no ability to push back against that market realism. There's nothing you can do sort of argument.
Interesting. You talk about the rise of authoritarianism as a result of this sort of breaking faith in institutions. Why does authoritarianism feel more attractive all of a sudden? What's happening there?
Yeah, I think at this moment we're caught between sort of the rocks and the whirlpool, to use that old kind of Greek image, and we're trying to chart a path between them. The rocks are sort of this authoritarian kind of appeal, and the whirlpool, the equally unsatisfactory option, would be to revert to sort of the top-down politics, the trust me, I'm a technocrat, sort of expert kind of politics of the past. Why does that authoritarianism look so popular? I think there's a bunch of reasons. Partly it is that it's been fueled by, this growing resentment over immigration and this kind of nationalist, xenophobic sort of movement, and the authoritarian strongman who will take charge of those ideas can look incredibly attractive. But I also think it's because the more markets approach of the last 30 to 40 years has failed so badly. I mean, it's delivered some great rewards for some people, right? In America, say, huge rewards for people at the top, but there are whole tranches of American society, that have been left behind, and that's a well-worn narrative, right? But it's really striking when you look at the median wage for certain groups in America, particularly men without a college degree, and the extent to which those wages have fallen away. And so you have lots of people who are very dissatisfied, for whom the promises of the last 30, 40 years have not proven to be true. And so the natural response is to say, well, maybe something else will deliver for me, and authoritarianism sounds like that. And just to add one final thing, democracies can be messy. And someone once said, democracies don't make any fewer mistakes than other systems. They just fix them more quickly. And that's true, but sometimes all people see is the mistakes. And they look at authoritarianism and they think they'll get things done. And you can look at China, and if they want to build a whole ton of renewable energy, they just go ahead and build it, and they don't have to worry about getting the consent of anyone. And there's a certain kind of appeal. I think it's a false appeal, but I can understand why people find that appealing.
Yeah. One element that I see, and I'm not sure quite how to draw the line, but there's a connection between the rise of conspiracy theories, the rise of mistrusting experts and believing your own ability to Google more than like someone who studied for 8 years in medical school. And with also this mistrust of institutions, it's all of these people out there that are telling me or pretending to know what's right, and I can find my own stuff. And then if you Google very quickly, you kind of end up in these like pretty extreme right-wing publications, and they look the same as a very professional media company because it's easy. It feels like mistrust is something that's percolating and makes you reach out to whatever is out there.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think to a large extent, that is down to the atomization of society. And that's not necessarily an answer that everyone would give you. I think it's fascinating how we think about individuals and groups, because there's often this distrust of the group in the sense of the mob, that the mob is irrational, that large groups of people together are dangerous. And of course, self-evidently, that can be true. But there's pretty good evidence that the people who are most susceptible, certainly to authoritarian movements, and look, I haven't studied this, but I suspect it would be true of conspiracy theories as well, is the isolated individual, the person who doesn't have strong social networks, the person who isn't part of a rich communal life. Because they're isolated, they're not doing well, they're not feeling connected to other people, they're easy prey for these kinds of seductive theories, whether they be authoritarian or conspiratorial. And of course, there's quite a lot of overlap between those two things. I think that some of those breakdown of society, the bowling alone, Robert Putnam type thing, we've lost a lot of that communal life, certainly in Western societies. I think that's a big part of it. And then the difficulty, of course, is that there's an element to which people's mistrust of the system is understandable. Like I said, there's lots of people for whom the last 30, 40 years, the more markets approach hasn't delivered. And there is a need, I think, to do politics differently. I mean, I have to be careful here, not to sort of pander to conspiracy theorists, but to remove the conditions in which people might more easily become conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And it rings true. And I also remember reading an article about rise of Steve Bannon in the States, who was political consultant to Trump, and how a lot of it was about weaponizing single alienated white males. And I think it was even the moment he realized it had to do with some sort of controversy around video games. Like it was like he realized that there's this massive crowd of very frustrated, very lonely people that he could turn into a movement. So what you're saying maps onto that beautifully. And so that's really interesting. And so, a lot of what you're talking about, reforming democracy for the digital age, assumes that democracy is worth saving. And, I'm on that train, but I want to play devil's advocate for a minute. Why is democracy even worth saving? Why shouldn't we just all become like China or like some other country that seems to be doing good work and is very effective without that human rights and democracy nonsense?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question. And I think there's both a philosophical and a pragmatic response. The philosophical one, I think, is just that I think there's something really beautiful about democracy. At its heart is the idea that each of us is capable of taking on the burdens of being part of the major political decisions that affect our lives. And when you think about humankind, that for so many centuries, millennia even, has existed very often on the presumption that you need someone better than you to organize things, whether it be a dictator or a king or whatever. That's actually a really beautiful and in some sense a still revolutionary idea. So I think democracy is very attractive in, what technically you'd call normative terms, the idea of active citizenship, of people participating in the key decisions that affect their lives. But also even just, I do think there has to be a practical defense of democracy as well. Your question is very well put. If democracy didn't actually work, would those philosophical attractions be sufficient? Probably not. But I think the evidence is democracies do work. I mean, authoritarian regimes can have certain successes, but as the political scientist Robert Dahl pointed out decades ago, if they were really going to consistently pursue the common good, the people in charge of authoritarian regimes, even if they're technocratic elites, they would have to know what is the common good. They would have to want to be able to pursue it, and they'd have to be able to pursue it. And actually, generally, none of those things is true. And actually, if you look at the best performing countries across the world, they are still the democracies, particularly on all the social indicators. It's a cliche, but it is the Scandinavian, Nordic type societies. They have stronger economies. They have higher standard of living. They make better environmental decisions than the authoritarian regimes. And by the way, China is, or maybe Singapore are the ones that people focus on. They often forget all the other completely disastrous autocracies, which is kind of convenient to omit. And just one final point, I was reading a book called The Good Ancestor about long-term thinking. And when you do really sophisticated analyses, it shows that actually autocracies don't even make better long-term decisions, which is interesting because some people, particularly maybe on the radical left, are saying, look at the climate crisis, democracies just can't cope with them because democracies are so short-termist in their thinking. Well, actually, the evidence is that democracies make better long-term decisions than autocracies do. So even that argument for autocracy fails.
Those are all really, really good positive examples of how democracies can do better. Growing up in Israel and having been indoctrinated in studying the Holocaust and having visited concentration camps, I always believed that's exactly the type of thing that cannot happen in a democracy. And that once you remove the guardrails and the human rights and the court system and the separation of powers, it might not happen immediately. Maybe you have a good person in charge now, but eventually the worst kind of disaster can happen. And I think that might be why I actually don't see a lot of, there's authoritarianism in Israel, but also a very vivid kind of instinct for democracy and argument. And it's very hard to see who could actually take over because even their own side don't support them all the time. It's really interesting. So democracy is worth saving. And you've identified some things that governments and we all can do to improve our chances of saving them. So, I'd love to hear what are some of your prescriptions.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, democracies can turn sour. The thing about democracy, and I think watching Trump has reminded people of this, is that there's nothing God-given about it, if I can use that phrase. There's nothing eternal. Democracy is just really a set of conventions, just like everything else, and you can sweep those conventions away. That's the frightening thing about it. But the best way to ensure that doesn't happen, I think, is to keep upgrading and renewing democracy. It can't stand still as a way of doing things. And in the big sweep of things, we've had much more direct forms of democracy in the past, and Athens is the one that people often cite. And then we developed this idea of representative democracy. You elect people to do democracy on your behalf. Then in the 20th century, on top of that representative democracy, we grafted a whole lot of things where we as citizens don't exactly get directly involved in the business of politics, but we do a lot of scrutinizing of it. The thinker John Keane calls it monitory democracy, because we now have all these ways of monitoring what our representatives are doing through the media, through audit bodies, whatever name they have in people's different countries, through consultation processes, through freedom of information laws, all these kinds of things. So democracy has always evolved, and it looks very different now to what it looked like in, 1776 or 1850 or whenever. But I think it has failed to take some of the steps it needs to in recent decades to keep doing that evolution and to regain some of that trust that we've talked about people having lost. And, if you had to sum up what I think democracies need to do to really bring themselves into the 21st century, it's about empowering ordinary people to be more directly involved in decision-making, but in an intelligent way. And that's crucial. And that's how you chart the path between sort of, authoritarianism and populist movements, which are saying, hey, ordinary people should be more involved, but in an awful kind of way. And that sort of the failed technocratic top-down approach of the past is you create forums, and we're starting to see these crop up around the world, climate assemblies, citizens-initiated reviews of the kind that you have in the States, participatory budgeting, crowdsourced legislation, crowdsourced constitutions even. They're all about getting ordinary people engaged, but creating forums in which people listen and think and are well-informed and are actually, encouraged to bring the wisdom of the crowd to the surface. I think that's crucial. That wisdom of the crowd is a real thing, but it only emerges under very specific conditions. But it's empowering the people, empowering the crowd, but making sure that the crowd is working intelligently for me, is the crucial element.
You're listening to Remake, a podcast about design, systems, and society. If you're listening on a podcast app, you already know how to follow podcasts. So please follow this one. If you're listening in a browser, just go to remakepod.org to find links to all the major podcast players where you can follow our show. So let's pick one of those new tools that you're proposing, citizens assemblies. So what are citizen assemblies and how do they work?
Yeah, so they're a really interesting example because they're absolutely not the be-all and end-all, but they're a very pure sort of form of what I'm talking about. Essentially, a citizens' assembly is a concept in which you get a polling company or whatever to bring together a demographically representative sample of people. And it might classically be about 100, 150 people that the government has brought together to consider a really important issue of public policy. And climate change is a classic one that these citizen assemblies are being used for at the moment. And so what happens is you bring together this beautifully representative group of people. They exactly represent the population in terms of their demographics, their age, their ethnicity, their gender, their income level, all the rest of it. They're brought together either for, say, a week or for more commonly a series of weekends. And they go through this process whereby they're trained in how to discuss things well with each other, which we all know from real life is not an ability that we are endowed with necessarily by nature. So they're given that training. Then they're put in front of experts and the evidence on the issue at hand. So it might be climate change. They're put in this environment where they're encouraged to listen, to reflect on their own views, to change those views in line with evidence and more persuasive arguments. Then they're given time to discuss the issue deeply. And then they come to a set of recommendations which have the consensus of the Citizens' Assembly behind them. And consensus doesn't have to mean absolutely everyone agrees. It might mean 80% of people agree and the other 20% can live with the decisions that have been made. And then ideally what happens is that the decisions of that Citizens' Assembly are, at the very least, responded to deeply by the government that commissioned them, or, more preferably, are actually put into practice, because the whole point of the Citizens' Assembly, to step away from the mechanics and think about what is the principle that's operating underneath this thing, is that the Citizens' Assembly's decision represents the decision that we would all as a country come to if we could discuss the issues under such beautifully perfect conditions as the ones that they have been empowered with.
As you were speaking, I was thinking, isn't that what originally the parliament was supposed to do? And they are representative of people. We voted them, and there's all of these different parties and with all of these different views. But then I realized they're playing for the cameras maybe too much. They're thinking too much about being elected again. And so just replacing 120 parliament members with 120 people who are not running for any office, but are representative could be really interesting.
Yeah, and look, for one thing, most parliaments, houses of representatives, whatever, often aren't very representative. I mean, often there's a huge gender imbalance, for instance. Very often the representatives are vastly wealthier than their constituents, and that's certainly very true in America. There's also the playing to the cameras element. Of course, lots of bits of democracy do have to be in front of the cameras, otherwise we wouldn't have scrutiny. But yeah, citizens' assemblies, the actual discussion takes place away from the cameras, and so you do get a better quality of discussion. And thirdly, you don't have party politics. Now, I'm not someone who thinks that parties are quote-unquote bad, but they force people into taking very rigid lines. They create an oppositional nature in politics that is actually artificial. They militate often against finding the best solutions, and they certainly militate against consensus, and that's baked into them just about. And so, although a citizens' assembly might sound a bit like a House of Representatives, actually the nature of the discussion that happens in them, particularly when people are free of party political entrenched positions, is profoundly different.
Yeah, I think another ill of parties is the brand and tribe loyalty that they start engendering. I had an idea. I wonder what you think of it, but like a while ago, maybe we just ban political brands. So every election you have to invent a new brand just for that election, and the next time you have to, it could be the same people, but you have to call it something completely different, so it doesn't have that emotional history of loyalty. Because I think that's a bypass. Brands have found a way to bypass reason, and parties maybe should not be allowed to use that power, because there are people in Israel that vote for the same party every single election, no matter what, because their parents voted for it. And that doesn't make any sense, because the people are all different, the agendas are different, the values are different, everything is different. So it's just a random thought. What do you think?
I like the creativity of that thought. I also suspect that on the creativity front, parties would find ways to, of course, to get around it. So they say, you can't use the same brand as last time, but we'll use one that's just very similar. Or we'll say,
Right.
this isn't the People's Party, this is the People's Party 2.0. I mean, parties, for all that they're frustrating, I mean, my ancestors were involved in New Zealand politics in the 1800s before there were political parties. And it was chaos. You just elected a set of individuals who then turned up at the parliament, and you had literally no idea what was going to happen because, no one had won on a coherent platform of getting a majority of parliament. So they're frustrating things, parties, but I suspect we're stuck with them in more or less their current forms.
Yeah, interesting. And so another form that you mentioned is online consensus building. And that's another tool. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so that's something that places like Taiwan have made great use of. I mean, it's just such an obvious thing, right, in the age that we live in, that we can connect, we should be able to connect in wonderful ways online, yet, of course, we don't very often. And, democracy going forwards, there's great advantages to in-person things. That's really powerful, and that works better for some people. But actually, online works better for other groups of society. So we should be making the maximum use of those things. And so the online consensus forming, so the example I often give is the way that Taiwan responded to the arrival of Uber on its shores. And their response was, well, hey, this is a great disruptive technology, but how do we ensure that it actually works for everyone's benefit? How do we ensure that Uber plays by the same rules that everyone else does? And instead of just sort of looking slow and out of touch like governments often do when faced with disruptive technology, instead of doing a kind of lame sort of consultation, what they did was basically use some intelligent online platforms which basically allowed people to sort themselves initially according to their stance on the issue, but then to discuss issues within these groups that were operating within this platform and to start putting up ideas for how they would regulate Uber. And it was an iterative process. So people would put up an idea, and if it didn't get 80% support within their group, then it got knocked back. They had to go away, refine it, argue the case again, keep pushing it up until it got over 80%. And that happened in sort of the distinct groups, and then that was brought together at the end. And so what you ended up with was a set of, I think it was 7 core recommendations that had emerged from this online consensus building process. And then what I loved is that the Taiwanese government then basically had this big meeting with Uber in the full view of the public. So, very going against the citizens' assembly model, they actually, here's a point where scrutiny is really valuable, like live streamed their meeting basically with Uber and transcribed it for people to read afterwards. And they put these proposals to Uber. And because these proposals had come out of an online consensus process, they clearly represented the will of the people. They had real force behind them. And so Uber immediately agreed, I think, to 6 out of 7 of those recommendations. And so that's something, it's much quicker, it's more agile, it's more nimble than a citizens' assembly. And so it just shows you that there's all these different forms we can now draw on in this task of reinventing democracy.
Amazing. And I think you mentioned that the tool was called Police. Is that the tool? As the product designer,
Yeah.
I'm actually interested in the design of something like this. So is this just a series of proposals that have to be voted on, and it doesn't progress until it gets to 80%?
Yeah, that's the core of it. And there's also an element often in the polis processes where people are initially, as I think I mentioned, sorted into different groups according to their response to an initial question. And although that might sound divisive, it actually allows for a bit of coherence initially because, if you just have everyone in the group chat, as it were, and everyone's kicking their ideas around and you've got people starting from a libertarian or quite socialist ends, actually that can just be quite chaotic. So a bit of coherence initially is quite a good thing, allow people to form views that are coherent amongst a subgroup and then put those up into the bigger group. So you're getting the right discussions happening at the right time and you're making it all manageable. That's one great platform. I mean, there's many of them here in New Zealand. People have come up with one called Lumio, which works a bit differently, but it's quite similar. It allows clear exchange of opinions. It allows people to put up polls quite quickly, almost as temperature checks. Oh, okay, are we all here on this? Actually, are we all agreed on this? Can we move on? Oh, actually, no, we're not. This thing needs further discussion. There's a whole bunch of different platforms that I think are evolving, unsurprisingly.
I've been following this digital democracy trend, and there are all these incredible platforms. This Democracy OS that came out of Argentina. And I really do think some of the solution is in the software in the end. Like whatever ideas we build, a lot of it will have to be a brand new way of connecting and voting and agreeing on things. And that brand new way is very likely not to work with paper and mail. It's very likely to have to require something new.
I think there's real value in both online and face-to-face mechanisms. One of the other ideas I really like was called participatory budgeting, or you could call it community-led budgeting. Your municipal council, let's say your city government, puts up a chunk of its infrastructure budget for the public to allocate directly. That's a really powerful idea, spreading out from Brazil in the 1980s, sort of now being taken up in different forms all around the world. The original Brazilian model is very face-to-face and it's quite labor-intensive. This budget has become available, so people are literally kind of on street corners almost in community halls. They're saying, hey, should we spend this money on a new health centre or some improvements to the local streets that'll make them a lot safer? And that discussion builds up and it's very face-to-face. Conversely, in Iceland, they have the Better Reykjavik program, which is the same thing as budgeting, but it's very online. People can suggest ideas. There's a beautiful interface for people to post ideas, you post drawings, post the rationale for them, for people to discuss the ideas that are put forward. There's a point where sort of the city engineers go through and provide, a bit of a reality check on some of the things, because I'm not against experts, I should add. I think subject matter expertise is really important. It's just that people are also experts in their own lives and we need to bring those different forms of expertise together. You have the sort of technical experts being involved as well, but a lot of the stuff is done online. And then there's a big online vote in the Better Reykjavik scheme for what things should we be spending our money on. And they can do it online because they're an incredibly connected society and they're quite a small society and they ensure the security of the process through various ways. Those are the two ends of sort of how you do this deep democracy, one very face-to-face, one very online. I don't think either of them is better than the other. I think they'll both just work brilliantly and beautifully in different conditions and would be crazy if we didn't make full use of both of them where appropriate.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And it's incredible to hear about these real innovations and experiments with budgeting. The reason why liquid democracy might not work in person. So this is a theory that was developed by Lewis Carroll, a mathematician many, many years ago. But really wasn't practicable until the digital age, which is the idea that you can delegate your vote to someone you trust on a specific issue, and that they could delegate all of the votes that have been delegated to them. So you essentially start creating like pools of power. And I think what's really interesting about this is it solves the expert problem, because you don't have to trust the experts, but you can trust your friend who's more knowledgeable than you. And they might trust a blogger that they read, that they really trust. And that blogger is probably more informed on economics and probably trusts an economist to really look into the issue. And it starts creating this middle tier of power players that are not politicians and are not just the general population, but they are trusted people to participate in particular types of decisions. So for instance, you might give them your economy vote, and you might give someone else your civil liberties vote or your health vote, you give your doctor maybe. And so I find that really interesting. And then, the systems that started playing with it, it's kind of a beautiful way to bring the expert back in, but build them up from the popular sentiment.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. And I was familiar with that core idea of the delegation of the vote, but I certainly never thought about those implications in the way that you put it there. I guess my concern would be, I can see that working well as a one-off process, as a one-time thing. But what would happen is as you kept repeating it, and I guess one of the things I would be worried about is, if I can use a sort of metaphor, of a kind of the atrophy of people's sort of democratic muscles, because if people aren't actually really deeply engaging themselves, they're delegating that to other people, they are to some extent, stepping away from the democratic process. Now, obviously, there's an element where they still have to be informed enough to think, well, who do I delegate my decision to? But it wouldn't be hard for me to see that over time, that turning into a kind of atrophy where people just aren't engaging at all. And actually, as those sort of democratic muscles weaken, if you like, they lose even really the ability to delegate intelligently, because they're just becoming more and more switched out because they've had that responsibility taken away from them. You might entrench a sort of elite of decision makers who had all this delegated power, who actually weren't terribly accountable anymore to people who were very switched off. Although I understand why people would advocate for that kind of system, my preference is almost for the opposite in a way, which is to get more people to step up to their full democratic responsibilities, actually being directly engaged in those decisions themselves. And I think there's two things there. One is, a lot of these processes work really well at the local level, where actually people are, as I said, experts in their own lives. And so often why government goes wrong is because a set of politicians decide, well, this community needs X, and actually that community needed Y. And that community knew that they needed Y, but they weren't in charge of the decision-making. And their expertise in their own lives, alongside the technical expertise that it takes to build whatever thing it is that they actually need, is really crucial. And also the evidence from citizens' assemblies and things like that is that experts are constantly amazed by how good ordinary people are at making decisions if they're put in a good situation. And look, the average person on the street, of course, says totally stupid things when they're vox popped, when they're sort of ambushed by the media or they're just asked for a knee-jerk reaction. But you put people in these citizens' assemblies, you train them, you get them in a mindset where they're listening and they're thinking and they're reflecting and shifting their views. And people do absolutely astounding work. So the problem with democracy is not people. It's the situations in which we've been asking them to do their democratic work. As a final point, people are engaged in citizens' assemblies. When you follow up with them a couple of years later, it's energized them to become much more active democratic participants. So they're measurably more likely to have then gone on to, at least write to their senator or get involved in some kind of campaign or signed petitions or whatever. So it's actually, for me, it's about making people more active and stepping up to their responsibilities rather than delegating those responsibilities to other people, I guess.
Yeah, that does make sense. I will say, just to be fair to the liquid democracy folks, they don't necessarily mean that you park things permanently. You always have the ability to pull it back, and also you might actually get it back after every vote. So it's just an additional option in addition to voting yourself if you feel like you're not an expert.
I appreciate that. That's a feature of the system. I just worry that even if it were, of course, theoretically possible, and I get that they have thought about these design issues, of course, you would re-endow people with that decision every time. I just worry that once people got used to delegating their decision, even if they didn't have to, they would then continue to do so as those sort of muscles atrophied. I guess that would be my concern.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. So you talk about two kinds of faith in your book, which is faith in government, faith in the ability of government to do good work, and faith in other people, faith that your fellow citizens can rise up to the occasion. So talk to me about that a little bit. What kind of mindset do we need to have?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of a kind of complicated double movement I'm trying to do there. One is which is to say, I think governments have got a bad rap, just very crudely speaking, in the last 30 to 40 years. I've heard a lot about how inefficient and incompetent they are. But actually, when you look at the the track record, there's a lot of core stuff that governments deliver better than markets can. And a lot of the privatizations and deregulations and stuff haven't worked particularly well. The very public healthcare systems, the NHS in Britain, or single payer, single buyer models in continental Europe function much more effectively than the privatized American healthcare system. Conversely, the British privatized water delivery system works much worse than publicly run water utilities in, continental Europe and other parts of the world. So partly I think, we need to actually have faith that governments have performed better in the past than we've been led to believe. And it's not true that they're incompetent and have got no incentives to improve themselves and innovate and all the rest of it. But at the same time, I do also think they haven't renewed themselves enough. And I think crucial to that renewal of government, that renewal of democracy that involves all of us being more active participants in democracy, is a faith in our fellow citizens. And I think that's crucial because there's this distrust of the mob. There's this distrust of ordinary people, particularly amongst the sort of educated elites from which I come. There's sometimes almost a disdain, for the ordinary voter. How could those people be so stupid as to vote for insert authoritarian of your choice? And I think that's really dangerous. And actually, the evidence is that people are really capable of taking on their democratic responsibilities if they're put in good situations, situations that encourage them to think intelligently and listen to other people. And that idea, that sort of distrust of the mob and the group, I think, again, is false. There's this model, and I think it's particularly popular in places like America, of individual rationality, that how does one come to know the truth? It is through being strong in yourself as an individual, pursuing your own individual line of reasoning, not being swayed by other people, being an individual seeker after the truth. And of course, elements of that are vital and are just a basic part of being human. But actually, problem solving is very fundamentally a group activity. And in any group, the solution to the problem will generally be distributed, and each person has a part of the puzzle, but none of them has the whole of it. And that solution won't come to the surface. We won't assemble all the pieces of that puzzle unless we can come together, discuss the issues with each other, and each of us, bring to the surface that bit of the answer. And so in a sense, and this is not my thought, I'm quoting from other people here, but actually rationality is not something predominantly that we arrive at as individuals. It's something that we arrive at in discussion with other people. And that's why I think we can have that faith in our fellow citizens.
Yeah, and it definitely sits well with my designer sensibilities. Designers have long known that we work better in groups, that we each have part of the puzzle, that we can feed off of each other's ideas and find better solutions that way. And it feels right that the best solutions come from groups working together.
There is one really crucial point on this, and I find this a distinction that's so telling, because there are people who would still argue that group discussion is a bad idea because it makes people more extreme. And Cass Sunstein, who's quite an influential figure in American political and legal circles, makes this argument. He says, in a group discussion, the strong, confident voices, and they would classically be people of my demographic, will speak up first. People are, quite prone to follow the leader. They will listen to these more extreme voices, and the group will become more extreme. And so he pushes back against sort of participatory democracy and deliberative democracy, discussion-based democracy. But the counterpoint to his argument is that what he's talking about is only true in badly structured discussions. I mean, that is in a poorly moderated, poorly facilitated, poorly structured discussion, yes, the loudest voices will predominate and the group will become more extreme. But in well-moderated, well-facilitated, well-organized discussion, and there's really good academic evidence behind this, the opposite is true. If you have a dynamic discussion with turn-taking where everyone's voices are encouraged to come to the surface, where no one is allowed to dominate, the group becomes more moderate. People listen, they understand the wisdom of other people's positions, and they shift towards a more consensus view of the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's another thing that designers have learned is that facilitated workshops help come to better solutions. So I'd love to ask you a final question. So this is a question we usually ask all of our guests at the end. So the philosopher Alain de Botton, in his TED Talk, talks about the difference between a lecture and a sermon. And, he's saying a lecture is the modern secular equivalent where it's assumed that a person is smart enough to make their own decision. And so you just are giving them a little bit of dry information and they're going to make up their mind. A sermon, which he thinks we should get back to, is an urgent plea that can change someone's life. And it's done with care, with actual care about, them having a better life. And so I'd like to ask you if I gave you the stage to give a short sermon, if there's one thing that you really think could change people's lives for the better, what would that sermon be?
Gosh, that's a fantastic challenge. I think my sermon would be on, appropriately enough, given the terminology, would be on that faith in one's fellow citizen, faith in the potential for democracy to renew itself, and faith, I think, for the power of wisdom to spread intelligently in groups. And I think, and there's a common theme amongst those things. There's an image sometimes given about wisdom and discussion and the spread of knowledge, that it's a bit like lighting a candle, in the sense that you light one candle, that candle can then light others without in any sense extinguishing its own flame. So it's not a scarce resource, it's not a zero-sum game. In discussion, we can inform and educate and share things with other people without any loss from ourselves. So it's this thing that beautifully expands, it multiplies, it grows greater than itself. And when you look at the really exciting examples of this new sort of citizen-driven, bottom-up democracy, that's what you see happen. People coming in as a collection of individuals with their own disparate views and often not entirely informed on the subject. And then you see that knowledge spread amongst people and that wisdom and just also those perspectives, people's real lived experiences, which are important democratic information, just like technical knowledge about how a structure works. You see that knowledge develop amongst people, and you see people making good use of that enhanced knowledge to listen, to reflect, to come to a consensus with people whom they might have believed to be their political opponents. And the thing is, you see time and again that people are capable of doing that work. We live in a time of great distrust, I think, of the ordinary voter and the ordinary person. And so my sermon would be on the wisdom of having faith in your fellow citizens.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Max.
Thank you.
All right, that's it for today. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to support it, please consider writing a 5-star review in Apple's podcast app or wherever you're listening. It helps many more people discover the podcast and also makes us feel good. Current support for the podcast comes from my own design company, Remake Labs. We run design sprints all over the world, and our goal is to improve outcomes, whether in business or various organizations, through repeated and rapid design interventions. Now, until next time, be well, everyone. See you next week on Remake.